The voice on the radio said, "My name." A few weeks ago, my husband Mark and I were in our car driving down a deserted country road, when suddenly the radio turned on by itself. "You turned the radio on?" I said to him, because I know he likes to listen to the radio on this old transistor radio that he has got here. He'd been fiddling around with it earlier, trying to get it to work. And we have this little toggle switch here that allows us to turn it on and off. But we don't have any control over what station comes through. Just kind of picks up whatever's broadcasting at that time. And it was very, very faint, and we could barely hear anything. But then we started to hear some voices, and then they started speaking more clearly, and then suddenly they were really loud. Well, the voice said, "Don't go inside." Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this show called The Twilight Zone, but there was an episode called It's a Good Life, which aired in 1963 and starred William Shatner. And it's about this boy who has superpowers, and everyone in his town is afraid of him, so they try to keep him away from them. He lives with his parents in this house on the hill, and the people try to warn each other if they were going to go to town to avoid passing by his house. But sometimes they forget, and they end up having to go back home because the boy uses his powers against them. And the voice warned, "Don't go inside." And so we stopped the car and we started talking about this, and we decided we were gone. Nah, drive right past my childhood home. Now it's probably been about 42 years since I lived there. I haven't even seen the house in almost 40 years. We found it pretty quickly. It looks exactly the same, except for the fact that the paint is peeling away from the siding and the lawn is a lot overgrown. It looks like the family that owns it now has a lot of parties and they never clean up their garbage. There's cans and bottles all over the yard. I would have preferred if they had bulldozed the place down, but it's still standing. And so we sat in the car. We didn't know what to do. We were both terrified. Then the voice came on again, and it said, "Go inside." And it was at that point that I realized it must be safe. If it's telling me to go inside, then it must be safe. But why? Why would it tell me to go inside? What does that mean? So we parked the car, and we walked up the driveway, and we rang the doorbell, and a young woman answered the door. She looked maybe 27 or 28 years old. She was very nice, and she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, I used to live here a long time ago. And is it okay if I take a look around? She said, "Oh no, not at all, I'm sorry. We don't allow anyone to come onto the property because of the lawsuits. You know, Anthony Hopkins killed 2 people here," and then she slammed the door in our face. And Mark and I started looking around to see if we could find another way inside the property. And that's when we saw these 2 headstones buried deep within the foliage, covered in vines and creeping things. And they belonged to a man and wife named Adam and Eve. But the most interesting part of it is the dates on the headstones. They died in 1955 and 1964, and I thought, well, that's odd. How could this guy have died in 1964? He wasn't born yet. Then we noticed that there were fresh flowers on the graves. And Mark said, "Let's see if we can find out who's living in that house." So we went down to the local library, and Mark did a little research, and he found out that the owner of the house was a 35-year-old man who had recently inherited the property from his grandmother. And we learned that his name was Anthony Hopkins. And then we started thinking, well, why would this voice tell me to go inside the property? Is it possible that Anthony Hopkins is somehow related to me? So we started doing some genealogy research, and we found out that my great-grandfather on my mother's side was named Anthony Hopkins. And then we found out that he had a brother named John Hopkins. And John Hopkins had a son when he was 70 years old. And we know the name of that son because it's listed on the gravestone. It says Anthony Hopkins, which means that this Anthony Hopkins is the one who lives in the house now, is my first cousin once removed. But then we started thinking, well, why would he put a gravestone for his father and his grandfather on his property? Well, the answer became obvious when we found out where he was buried. Because if you look closely at the gravestones, they're not actually in a cemetery. They're not actually on the property. They're actually across the street in the public park. And we found this out because we started digging to try to figure out why would he have a gravestone like this? Why isn't he buried next to them? And then we found out that the stones are actually in a different location. And so we went to that location and we found the graves, but they were in a different place than the stones. And then we started to wonder, what if the voice is coming from somewhere else? What if the voice is not coming from Anthony at all? What if it's coming from someone who's dead? And so we looked around and we found this broken marble statue of an angel with a trumpet. And on the back of the statue, carved in the stone, was the date 1899. And we thought, well, that's odd. Who's buried here? Well, it turns out that there was a funeral home right across the street. And we went in and asked them if they knew whose grave this angel was guarding. And the lady said, oh yes, that's the grave of Thomas Rice. He was a Civil War widow. He died in 1901. So this angel is 120 years old. So then we started to think, well, if the voice is coming from someone who's dead, then who's speaking to us? And we started researching Thomas Rice, and we found out that his son-in-law wrote a book called Whispers from Beyond. And it was a book of ghost stories that he experienced throughout his life. And we thought, well, that's odd. Maybe we're experiencing something similar to what he experienced? We don't know. We don't know if that's true or not. But while we were researching him, we also found out that he was a police officer. And we started wondering, what if this is some kind of test? What if this police officer is watching us to see if we're worthy? Well, after reading his book, we found out that he believed that ghosts were real, and he had a special talent for communicating with them. And he believed that the key to communicating with ghosts was to speak to them backwards. And we thought, well, that's odd. This is exactly what happened to us. Someone spoke to us backwards, and then we figured out what they were saying. So we started thinking, well, what if we tried speaking to Thomas backwards? And we started reading his book backwards, and we started hearing things. We heard him say, leave now, and we thought, well, we should probably do that. And then we heard him say, they're coming for you. And we didn't know what he meant by that, but we were getting scared at this point, so we left. We didn't go back to that house. We've never gone back to that house. We've never heard the voice on the radio again. But every time we hear a voice on the radio, we think, well, is that him or is it her? Because it sounded like a woman's voice. If you want to hear more scary stories, stay tuned for more content. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.